On the 5th of December 2022, the G7 switched on what economists called the most sophisticated economic sanction in history. By December 7th, it was already being circumvented. 400 to 600 aging tankers, registered across a dozen flag states, insured through obscure Emirati intermediaries, owned by companies that don't appear to exist, moving roughly 60 to 70% of all Russian crude exports. So the question isn't whether the shadow fleet works. It clearly does. The question is, how exactly does a ghost armada of this scale stay invisible in plain sight? And near the end of this video, in about 10 minutes, there's a specific ownership document. A corporate registration chain traced by analysts at the Kyiv School of Economics that shows you precisely how the mechanism is built. Once you've seen it, the enforcement problem stops looking like a failure of will and starts looking like something more structural. Before February 2022, Russia's crude export system was deeply integrated with Western maritime infrastructure. The vast majority of Russian seaborne oil moved on tankers owned or managed by companies in Greece, Norway, or the United Kingdom. It was insured by protection and indemnity clubs operating under English law. It was tracked by Lloyd's List Intelligence and reported against publicly available fixtures. The system was transparent, not because anyone required transparency, but because it ran on Western capital and Western legal frameworks that demanded it. When the invasion of Ukraine began, Western tanker owners started backing away, first quietly, then publicly. By the summer of 2022, most major European operators had withdrawn from Russian cargo. That withdrawal created a vacuum. And a vacuum in a market moving roughly 8 million barrels of crude per day doesn't stay empty for long. What filled it was a cohort of older tankers, mostly Aframax and Suezmax class, typically 15 to 20 years old, many of them previously headed for the breakers yard in Alang or Chittagong. These vessels were purchased through intermediary companies, re-registered under flags with minimal inspection regimes, and quietly inserted into the Russian export trade. The Kyiv School of Economics Shadow Fleet Tracker, which cross-references AIS data with ownership filings and cargo declarations, puts the fleet size at somewhere between 400 and 600 vessels as of early 2024. CREA, the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air, estimates this fleet moved crude worth over $160 billion in the 2 years following the price cap's introduction. The scale of what was built in less than 2 years is the starting point for everything that follows. The G7 price cap is not a traditional embargo. It doesn't ban the purchase of Russian oil outright. What it does is condition the use of Western services, shipping insurance, trade finance, brokerage, port facilitation, on the oil being sold at or below $60 per barrel. The theory was elegant. Because the global tanker insurance market is overwhelmingly dominated by the international group of P&I clubs, 13 mutual insurers operating primarily under English and Norwegian law, almost any serious seaborne cargo would need to pass through that system. Deny insurance above the cap, and you've effectively capped the price. The problem was a gap the size of a supertanker. The cap required compliance from service providers, not from buyers or sellers. A tanker that carries Russian oil above the cap is only violating the rules if it uses Western insurance, Western finance, or a Western broker to do so. Build a parallel system that uses none of those, and the cap simply doesn't apply. That's exactly what happened. The Shadow Fleet's insurance arrangements route primarily through Russian state-owned insurer Ingosstrakh or through smaller intermediaries registered in the UAE and India. These arrangements offer far lower coverage limits than standard P&I club insurance, often capped at $1 billion against the standard $3 billion or more that major port states require. Many ports in India, China, and Turkey have quietly accepted this reduced coverage or accepted letters of undertaking from entities whose actual ability to pay a major claim has never been tested. Nicholas Jakobsen, a maritime law researcher at Gothenburg University, has noted that this insurance gap isn't just a workaround, it's a structural liability that the global system hasn't priced in. A major casualty involving a shadow fleet tanker in, say, the Turkish Straits could produce a claims dispute that takes a decade to resolve, if it resolves at all. Here's where the mechanism gets genuinely intricate. Under IMO conventions, every commercial vessel must have a registered owner and a documented manager. The registry is public. The beneficial owner, the human or organization that actually controls and profits from the vessel, is not required to be disclosed in any publicly searchable database. The shadow fleet exploits this gap systematically. A typical vessel in the fleet might be nominally owned by a company registered in the UAE free zone of Ajman or Ras Al Khaimah, both jurisdictions with minimal disclosure requirements. That company is managed by a ship management firm registered in Hong Kong, with no named directors visible in the public register. The flag state, often Gabon, Palau, or the Cook Islands, has no resident inspector anywhere near the vessel's actual trading area. The Kyiv School of Economics Shadow Fleet Tracker has documented this pattern across hundreds of vessels. Take the MT Turba, a 20-year-old Aframax tanker with IMO number 9274638, registered in Gabon. Nominal owner, Coral Energy Trading LLC, Dubai. The tracker's analysts found the company was incorporated 14 months before the tanker's first shadow fleet voyage and has no other documented commercial activity. This is the document I mentioned at the start of this video, the incorporation chain that makes individual vessels sanctioning so difficult. Because by the time a sanctioning body formally identifies and adds the owning entity to a list, the vessel has typically been sold to a new shell company, re-registered and renamed. The U.S. Office of Foreign Assets Control has added dozens of individual vessels and entities to its SDN list since 2023. Each time, the pattern recurs. The sanctioned entity dissolves or transfers assets within weeks. This channel exists to trace exactly this kind of system, the maritime infrastructure that moves the world in ways the world doesn't often see. If you're finding this useful, subscribing keeps more of it coming. Automatic identification system transponders are the maritime equivalent of a phone's GPS. They broadcast a vessel's position, speed, heading, and identity every few seconds. Under SOLAS regulations, AIS is mandatory for all vessels above 300 gross tons in international waters. Turning it off is not legal, and yet the shadow fleet does it routinely. Marine Traffic and Vessel Finder have both published analyses of what the industry calls dark voyages, periods where a vessel's AIS signal disappears for hours or days, typically near known ship-to-ship transfer zones. The most active of these zones are in the waters off Ceuta, near the Laconian Gulf in Greece, and in a patch of the Gulf of Oman east of Fujairah. A vessel loads Russian crude at a Baltic or Black Sea port, goes dark somewhere in international waters, and reappears with a different declared cargo, sometimes a different declared destination. According to Lloyd's List Intelligence Analysis published in March 2024, AIS blackout events among vessels with known Russian cargo history increased by 340% between 2021 and 2023. The analysis covered vessels above 100,000 deadweight tons, large enough that an AIS gap is operationally significant, not a simple equipment fault. The STS transfer mechanism serves two functions. It obscures the Russian origin point on the final bill of lading, and it allows a Western-registered vessel to pick up the cargo in international waters without technically loading in a Russian port. A distinction that some compliance officers at major trading houses have, let's say, found convenient. The shadow fleet's cargo has found three primary markets: India, China, and Turkey. Each has its own logic. India's state refiners, particularly Indian Oil Corporation and Bharat Petroleum, have dramatically increased Russian crude purchases since 2022, drawn by a persistent discount to Brent, often in the range of $15 to $20 per barrel. India is not a G7 member. It has no legal obligation to observe the price cap. Its government has been explicit about this. India's crude imports from Russia went from near zero in early 2022 to roughly 1.8 million barrels per day by early 2024, making Russia the country's single largest supplier. China's purchases run through a different channel, largely via Shandong Province's independent refineries, known as teapots, which operate with less regulatory scrutiny than the major state-owned enterprises. These teapots specifically built out the import infrastructure for Russian ISPO crude moving through the Pacific Corridor, routes that the Shadow Fleet's older Aframax vessels are well suited for. Turkey's position is the most structurally interesting. Turkey is a NATO member and an EU candidate state, but not an EU member and not a price cap signatory. Russian crude enters Turkey at deep discounts, is refined, and re-exported as Turkish petroleum products to markets that cannot easily distinguish the feedstock origin. Istanbul's Tüpraş refinery processed more Russian crude in 2023 than in any year since its privatization. But here's where it gets stranger. The enforcement gap isn't simply about India, China, or Turkey refusing to cooperate. It's about the fundamental geometry of the sanction. Up to this point, most official accounts describe the shadow fleet as a circumvention problem, bad actors working around good rules. But after this, the picture looks different. The price cap was designed to reduce Russian revenue, not to stop Russian oil from moving. The G7 explicitly wanted Russian oil to keep flowing to avoid a global price spike. That design choice created a built-in ceiling on enforcement ambition. If you enforce hard enough to actually stop shadow fleet voyages, you tighten global crude supply and push oil prices up, which is exactly the outcome the cap was designed to prevent. The sanction contains its own governor. There's a commercial logic to the shadow fleet that isn't going away. A 20-year-old Aframax tanker that was worth roughly $8 million at scrap value in 2021 was fetching $30 to $40 million on the shadow market by 2023. For ship owners in Greece or Cyprus willing to sell to intermediaries without asking detailed questions about the buyer's identity, this was a generational windfall. The Institute of Shipping Economics and Logistics in Bremen tracked at least 60 major second-hand tanker transactions in 2022 and 2023, where the purchasing entity was a newly incorporated company with no commercial history. The incentive structure for the vessel's crews is grimmer. Shadow fleet tankers are typically crewed by seafarers from India, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, and Georgia, nationalities that staff the overwhelming majority of the global merchant fleet. They often sign contracts with management companies, not directly with the owning entity, creating layers of liability separation. The ITF, the International Transport Workers Federation, has documented cases of seafarers on shadow fleet vessels going unpaid for months, with no recourse because the nominal employer has no assets in any jurisdiction where a labor claim could be filed. Here's the ownership document. About 10 minutes ago, I told you we'd get to it. This is the Kyiv School of Economics trace of a vessel called the New Respect, a Suezmax tanker, IMO number 9364121, registered in the Cook Islands. Beneficial ownership traced through 3 shell companies across Dubai and Hong Kong, back to a management entity that shares a registered address with at least 14 other shadow fleet-connected companies in a commercial building in Ras Al Khaimah. The chain took the Kyiv School analysts several weeks to reconstruct from IMO filings, UAE corporate registry records, and satellite AIS cross-referencing. It's documented, it's specific, and it is functionally unsanctionable at speed because by the time a sanctions package clears legal review, the corporate structure has already mutated. What the shadow fleet reveals is less about Russian ingenuity than about the architecture of the global maritime system itself. Flag states sell registration to vessels they will never inspect. Free zone jurisdictions provide incorporation to companies they will never audit. AIS is mandatory but unenforceable in international waters. P&I insurance is a condition of port entry, except when port states quietly decide to waive it for commercial reasons. The G7 didn't inadvertently build the shadow fleet. The shadow fleet was always latent in the seams of the system. What the price cap did was create sufficient commercial incentive to activate it at scale. The fleet that emerged isn't a temporary workaround. It's a parallel tanker market, with its own insurers, its own brokers, its own flag states, its own port relationships. And the question now isn't whether it can be shut down. It's whether the mainstream system can absorb the safety and liability risk when one of these aging, underinsured vessels eventually has a major casualty in a sensitive waterway. That question doesn't have an answer yet, but it has a geography. And the most likely place it gets answered is a narrow corridor of water that every shadow fleet tanker transiting from the Black Sea has to pass through. If this got you, the next episode on this channel is about the Turkish Straits the 18-mile corridor that every Black Sea tanker, shadow fleet or otherwise, cannot avoid, and the treaty from 1936 that still governs who gets through.